Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to the Mini Sculpting Super Show, where we talk about miniatures, sculpting miniatures, everything miniatures. So it's episode 2, and this week we are going to go over how to part your miniatures. You know, if you're sculpting a figure and you don't want to just have it be flat and boring, sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you need that. But a lot of times you want to have more dynamic things going on with your miniatures. In order to do that and make it castable, moldable, you have to cut them apart so that they can be cast. Because if you got a guy sticking an arm up into the mold, it's just not going to fill with metal, plastic, whatever, and you won't be able to get it out. So let's get on with the tutorial.
Alright, so the first thing I'd like to show you here is this sculpt I've done of this monk girl. And this is a really good example of what I'm going to be showing you of how you need to part your miniature. So you can't tell quite from this angle here, but you'll see in a second as I turn it up how her arms completely break the mold plane. And what I mean by that is when a miniature is molded, you have two halves of a mold that kind of, and they separate where I'm drawing that line right there. But as you can see, and it usually goes along the feet because that's where a tab would be, but as you can see, the arms actually go almost perpendicular to that. And you can get away with a little bit of that in a mold, but with that arm sticking basically straight up into the mold, it will have to be removed. So that's the main thing. And the biggest thing I can tell you about this is what I'm going to show you right here. And that is, you can cut apart any miniature after it's finished. But if you think and plan ahead, you can make your life so much easier. So I'm basically going to show you the way you should design all your miniatures so that you can very easily separate the pieces in half. So this miniature has the same problem. See, it's got its left arm actually does go along with the legs, the feet, and it'll be on the mold plane. It's a little bit into one side of the mold, but you can build the mold to accommodate that so that it's not actually trying to push the arm up into the mold. But with the right arm, it is basically sticking straight up in the mold. So what you do is when you get the figure somewhat skinned, and this is another reason why I tend to leave the arms undone at first, is because of this step right here. So I've got my snips, and you just very, very gently put some pressure. You pinch wherever you plan on separating the piece. So here, I typically cut arms off at the shoulder. Sometimes, excuse me, you might cut them off at the wrist or elbow. There could be any number of places, but typically on human-sized figures, a good, nice spot to do it at is at the shoulder, and you just kind of score it a little bit, and you can kind of see the little indentions right there. And the reason for this is, as you'll see later on, is it will basically, the armature stays nice and strong, but it will allow you to easily snap the armature underneath without having to go in with a saw or try and score it with a blade afterwards, which you can very easily damage your miniature. Okay, so the next step, once you've done the scoring, is sculpt a miniature. Ooh, the easy part. No, just kidding. No, after it's all done, you go in with an X-Acto knife or a scalpel. It'll depend on the kind of angles you need, and be very careful here because it's very easy to cut through the clay, and you want to make sure that when you're pressing in, you're going to hit the wire or just be gentle so you don't slice the miniature in half or, heaven forbid, your hand. And you slowly cut around. And you might notice this here, and this is another reason why I tend to do it at the shoulders, is a lot of times there will be seams in clothing or armor. And what it allows you to do, if you cut very close to the seam, so in this case, he's got his tunic on, and he has that shoulder pad. So I'm cutting right next to those. And what this does is it allows the seam or the cut that you're creating, it will be hidden. If you cut, just in the middle of a sleeve there, if I were to have cut him like apart at the elbow, when you glued the figure back together, you would have this big, very noticeable line that you would either have to leave and accept it's there, paint over, and just let it be, or you would have to go back in with Greenstuff afterwards to patch that up. But when you make a nice planned cut in an area where the costuming can kind of hide it, you don't have to do any additional cleanup of the miniature after you've assembled it. Alright, so I finished cutting here, and now watch this. So if you hadn't done the scoring, you can still do this, but it's a lot harder and takes a lot longer. I'm just bending it back a couple times, and as you see, it just will pop right off in just a moment. This figure, you might have noticed, actually wasn't very egregious as far as breaking the mold plane. It was actually, if it wasn't for that staff, both arms could have been left as they were, but because that staff was going behind him, and I didn't want to try and blend it into a cape or something to kind of make it fill the form more, I had to break it off. So there you go. It's nice, clean shape there. Next thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how to create a socket to help the figure hold in there. So I've got two tools that I like to use when I do this, and I always use the Dremel. I've got the one that just can create a perfect ball, and then this is the one I tend to like to use the most, and it's a cylindrical kind of shaped grinding device. And the reason I like this is it's easier to create more of a angular shape. So if you go in at the side a little bit like that, or you could even just make a perfect cylindrical shape, but I like to create a little bit of an angle. The reason for this is when you have angular shapes for your sockets, it will help when you glue the arm on or try and assemble the piece after it's cast. It tends to make the arm want to stay in one position. Now if you want to be able to rotate around or something like that, then obviously more of a ball socket is better, or even a cylindrical tube. But in this case, I'm kind of going at it at the side, which will create a nice flat piece on one edge with a half cone going in there, which will keep it from bending. You can also get away at times without doing any sort of socket if you can cut the appendage or whatever piece you're coming off. You can cut it in somewhat of an angular way. That way, when you put the two pieces together, they just want to auto lock into one spot. Okay, so after you've drilled kind of your part A of the socket here, you know, the concave portion, you just need to mix up some putty. And right here, I'm just mixing up some Greenstuff. I added a little bit of Aves Apoxie Sculpt. And the main reason for this was just so that we cure faster. You can do straight Greenstuff, Procreate, whatever you prefer is fine. I tend to do Greenstuff by itself or with Aves just because it's a little bit tackier. And I can count it. So there I'm just holding up the arm just to kind of show myself and reorient that the way that I want it to be, and so I can understand it, because what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of putty on the side that we didn't bore out, so on his body, on his torso. And we're going to try and just have a little bit more than we need for what the to create the socket. And we'll see here, I'm just trying to really be sure that I got it right. Okay, I'm just pinching off a little bit. I'm going to put that on there in roughly the spot that I think the final socket will be. So you can see right here, I mean, this is the more sticky putty, and I'm already having a little bit of trouble getting it to stick, but good old clay shaper comes to the rescue. Okay, just get it, press it down along all the edges, because you want to make sure it sticks to the body nice and well, and then you get some sort of lubrication. This is Vaseline or petroleum jelly, and I'm just gonna put a little bit on the area. You can also use water or your saliva, just anything that will keep it from, you do not want it to stick to the arm. You only want it to stick to the torso where the male part of the socket will be. Okay, now this is very important. When you press this on, and this is why I was checking it very carefully before I put anything on, you want to make sure that you get it as close to line up the first time as possible. Alright, that fell off, so try and get a better grip. This one's a little hard to hold, but you want to press it in as much as possible, because ideally you want all the excess putty to kind of spread out like that, but you don't want the actual leftover socket to be sticking up and out farther than you want. So once you do that, just trim off all the excess. If at the end, after this all cures, it's still a little too large, you can still sand it down or trim it down just a little bit. But usually, if you don't put too much putty on to begin with, this is fine. And then I trim it off, and I just clean it up a little bit more there. And just be very gentle. You don't want to change the shape too much. Because the whole point of this is to make sure it sockets very well back into the arm there. Like I said, I keep showing arms and whatnot, but you can do this for any portion of the body. Sometimes you might need to cut them at the waist or leg. Okay, this is the last little bit. This is the easiest way you can part a miniature. So you see this tail here. So instead of doing any cutting or whatever, I actually left this tail to the end. I just drilled in to the back of the miniature, glued in a wire, and then sculpted the tail. And afterwards, you just wiggle it a little bit, and it pops right off. Super clean. It's ready to go. Alright, thanks for watching, and keep sculpting.